let's start with Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein himself is one of the strangest people of the 20th century. He was born into the second wealthiest family in Austria-Hungary, just behind the Habsburgs. He lived in Vienna, the youngest of 9 children. If you Google Wittgenstein house, you will find many different houses, because the Wittgenstein family owned a palace in Vienna, but then also houses all over Austria. Friends of the family included the sculptor Auguste Rodin, famous for The Thinker, and painter Gustav Klimt, composers Brahms and Mahler. And so he was very well connected, not only to people of immense power and wealth in Austria-Hungary, but also to people who were really the center of Austro-Hungarian culture. He was homeschooled until he was 14. Then he went to a technical school. One of his classmates was Adolf Hitler. Then he studied engineering in Berlin and Manchester. At 22, he got unhappy with engineering and decided he wanted to study logic. So he went to Cambridge to study with Bertrand Russell. And then later he taught at Cambridge. He took over G.E. Moore's chair. We'll find out more about Moore later. Russell described Wittgenstein as obstinate and perverse, but I think not stupid. Later he became convinced that Wittgenstein was an unparalleled genius. In any case, he was odd. He taught for a while at Cambridge. He served in the First World War with the Austro-Hungarian army. He spent many years then living in a Norwegian fishing village. He worked as a gardener for a while. He taught elementary school in a remote Austrian village where it was very difficult for him to keep his identity secret, but he did his best. He was known for being incredibly strict with the students. He taught them mathematics for 2 hours every morning, first thing. And if they did anything wrong, he would yell at them, shout at them, and even slap them. So imagine having him as your first grade teacher. Okay, Johnny, what's 1 plus 2? 2. No! Do it again! Anyway, we're going to be talking today about his first great work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. It is, well, an odd work, as you've probably seen. It's just propositions. In fact, there's a joke from John Cleese in a Fawlty Towers episode. Come on, man, this is not a proposition from Wittgenstein. The motto of the book is taken from Schoenberger. All that we know that isn't just rustling and roaring can be said in 3 words. And indeed, the book really, by its own light, is meaningless. By the time you get to the end, the moral is everything I've just told you is meaningless. Okay? But only now have you gotten to the point where you can see that it's meaningless.
Yes.
Now, he summarized the book this way. What can be said clearly. What cannot be said must be passed over in silence. And it turns out that a lot that he really cares about has to be passed over in silence. The logical empiricists of the Vienna Circle, Rudolf Carnap, Kurt Gödel, a number of others were inspired by Wittgenstein's work. They thought he was one of them. They saw his work as a logical empiricist work. Russell did too. Wittgenstein hated Russell's introduction to the Tractatus, thought he had got it completely wrong. The Vienna Circle invited Wittgenstein to speak before them. He came up before the group. They expected him to give a paper on logical analysis and the nature of the world and language and thought and so on. Instead, he turned his back to them and read poetry. Now, they were mystified by this. It just added to his reputation as a crazy person. But actually, I think it related to this last point. There are certain things he's maintained that can be shown but cannot be said. And so the point of reading poetry before the group is to say, look, I'm not saying that all that other stuff is nonsense. I'm saying that actually the most important things in life we can't really articulate. We can't even ask the question, let alone pose an answer. But that doesn't mean it isn't important. That doesn't mean it isn't there. And so we have to show it. Art can do that. Music can do that. Poetry can do that. The Tractatus maybe can do that. But he didn't think ordinary language could do it. Well, what is this book really about? It's about the relationship between mind and world. It's about the relationship, really, between thought. And let this circle represent the mind, and take that as being a thought, okay? I don't know what that's supposed to be, but it's just something, okay, that indicates something happens in the mind. It's a thought. And there is what we might say. The cat drinks water from the glass. And there is my cat Zadok drinking water from my glass. Something happens frequently in my house. I get myself some water. sit it on the table before I can drink any, the cat drinks it. Not always this cat, usually another cat. In any case, okay, so that's what we want to understand. The sentence, the cat drinks water from the glass, the thought, which has that as something like its content, and then this is the fact in the world. Well, actually, what you see here is a picture of the fact in the world. We're going to be interested in pictures and the ways in which language and thought depict things. Here's the traditional view, as formulated, for example, by Aristotle. The world consists of what? Of things, okay? Of people like you and me. Of objects like chairs and tables and cameras. Of maybe microparticles, scientific type objects like, I don't know, electrons, fields, things like that. That's what the world consists of. In the traditional philosophical terminology, those things are called substances. So the idea is the world consists of substances. Those substances have certain properties. For example, the camera is black, or my shirt is striped. They also stand in relations. I am wearing my shirt, or the camera is on the tripod. They have a location in space and time. Camera's over there, and my shirt is right here. They do things and have things done to them. And so all of those things, you might say, are our ordinary ways of categorizing the world. In fact, Aristotle describes all this in a work called The Categories. He just says, here's what it is. Look at language. There are nouns that refer to people, places, and things. Then there are verbs that say what they do or what is done to them. And then there are adjectives that describe their properties. There are all sorts of things like prepositions that refer to their relations. And then we have various ways of expressing their location in space and time, and so on. And so, really, he says, if you look at the structure of language and its grammatical categories, they match on to, very nicely, the categories of things in the world. Well, Wittgenstein is really denying this right at the outset, but he does maintain a deeper point that Aristotle is also maintaining. It is the correspondence theory of truth. We'll meet it a number of times in the course. The idea here is that thoughts and utterances are true when they correspond to reality. So I say, the cat drinks water from the glass, and that is true if and only if, well, there's a corresponding fact, you might say. The cat is actually drinking water from the glass. Now, actually, I've cheated a bit by saying the cat drinks water. The simple present in English is complicated. It's not in most languages, but in English it is. So actually, you might think that sort of means it habitually or frequently or routinely drinks from the glass and so on. Here, pretend that it's a sports reporter, okay? They often use the simple present in a way that just says it's happening now, okay? So, one of my favorite examples, Winfield's going back. He rams his head against the wall. It's rolling toward second base. Well, the ball was rolling toward second base, not his head. But anyway, notice, Winfield's going back. Actually, I cheated. Winfield goes back. He hits his head into the wall. It's rolling toward second base. The simple present there, he hits his head against the wall, means it happens right then. So ignore, in other words, all the complexities of tense for the moment. So the idea is just, you look at this, it's true if and only if something like that is going on in the world. That object really does stand in that relation to that other object. That object really does have that property. That object really is doing that thing, and so on. Well, look at Wittgenstein right at the beginning. You can read it here in German if you want, or in English. He starts out by saying the world is all that is the case. Okay? And he elaborates, he says the world is the totality of facts, not of things. Now, when I took a seminar on Wittgenstein's Tractatus, we spent an entire 2.5 sessions on just those two propositions. I don't recommend that. But here's the idea. He's trying to say, don't think of it the way Aristotle did. Don't think of the world as consisting of objects that have properties and stand in relations. Think about the facts. This object standing in that relation to that other object. The fact of this object having that property. In other words, don't think about the world consisting of the shirt and the camera and the table and so on. Think about the world as consisting of the shirt that's being striped, or the camera's being black, or me speaking. Okay, those are facts. Those are the things he wants to think of the world as consisting of. Why? Well, really, he's motivated by the correspondence theory. He says, when is a sentence or a thought true? When there is a corresponding fact. I say the cat drinks water from the glass, and there it is. The cat is drinking water from the glass. Notice the cat isn't enough to make that sentence true. The glass isn't enough. It requires that a certain relationship hold between them. And that is what he says is making sentences true or false. So think in terms of facts, not of things. Yeah?
What if you said, like, the blanket is comfortable? Is that a fact? Like, because it depends on, like, if somebody could think it's comfortable, somebody's not. So is it a fact, or is it true or false, or...
Ooh, good. The blanket is comfortable. Is that a fact?
That'd be an opinion.
Well, it is attributing a property to it. The question is that a simple property or is it a relational property? Is it comfortable for you?
It's a fact for me.
Yeah, it might be a fact for you. Or really the way Wittgenstein would say, yeah, look, don't be a relativist about this. Instead, just think it's a relational property, being comfortable. So you might say, that's comfortable. That really means the relationship between it and me produces comfort in me, or something like that. And so think of it as really relational. There are lots of things like that. If I say, for that matter, that something is large, that actually has a sort of hidden relational element. It doesn't look like it. And yet you might say, look, that's a large rat. Somebody says, well, rats are animals, so I guess that's a large animal. No, a large rat is still kind of a small animal. And so there's a kind of hidden relational part to that. And I think comfortable is like that. When you say that's comfortable, or actually my earlier example, that's yummy, you really kind of mean from his point of view that you find it yummy, you find it comfortable. So there's this hidden term that isn't explicit in the sentence. Now that points out something important, which is that we're going to act later as if the terms of sentences and the terms of thoughts and then the things in the world all neatly correspond to each other. But notice there, comfortable, that's a great example. There we've got something that's left out in the thought and left out in the sentence, but really seems like it has to be part of it in the world to make this make any sense. And so we're going to find places where there isn't a very nice one-to-one correspondence here, which complicates his picture and maybe even refutes it. He's going to think, no, really, there's this exact matchup, but maybe there's not. If we go on and look at the further propositions, the world is determined by the facts and by there being all the facts. So what do I need to know to describe the world exactly? I just need to list the facts. But then also to say, and that's all the facts, okay? I can't just list the facts and you want, well, is that the complete story or not? I have to say at the end, and that's all there is. The totality of facts determines what is the case and what is not the case. The facts in logical space are the world. The world divides into facts. So the world really is made up of facts. Don't think of the world as consisting of all these things. Think of the world as something like a big list of facts. Okay? Really, it's not just a list, of course, of facts. It's this complex combination of facts. That brings us to the second proposition. What is the case? A fact is the existence of states of affairs. I can think of a fact as being something like the cat drinking water from the glass. But I can describe that as a possible thing without it being actual, right? When I took the photograph, that was actually happening. The cat actually was doing it. So that state of affairs was actual. But if I describe it now, I didn't leave any water. Well, I mean, they have their water bowls, but there was no glass of water left in my house. So now it's false. It's a possible state of affairs that a cat would be drinking water from a glass in my house right now, but it's not actual. There was a question, yeah?
Yeah, but aren't there like a limited facts, like an infinite amount, like we're 5 hours away from Dallas by car and 20 hours by skateboard, you know?
Yeah. So, okay, good. If you think about the existing state of affairs, the actual facts, you're right. There are infinitely many of them. So this is going to be an infinite collection. The world will be an infinite collection of facts. But then if we think of the merely potential states of affairs, the facts that could obtain, that could be any configuration of objects at all, actual or possible. So if I start telling a story, I say, yes, once upon a time I had a class just like this. And we decided that when we got to Quine later and he talks about jungle linguists, we couldn't really understand it without going to the jungle and finding some wild tribes who spoke a completely unfamiliar language. And so we did that, and we ventured through the jungle. A mountain lion leaped out at us. Luckily, one of the students had an iPad and threw it like a frisbee and took the head of the mountain lion right off. Okay, now this did not happen, but it's a possible state of affairs, right? An extremely remote state of affairs, you might think, but nevertheless a possible state of affairs. So there are infinitely many of these state of affairs that really exist, that really are actual, and then there are infinitely many more that are just merely possible. Well, Wittgenstein advances what is called the picture theory. That's his basic idea of how thought represents the world and how language represents the world. Here's the idea. We picture facts to ourselves. If I describe that, the student throwing the iPad and beheading the mountain lion, or just thinking about my house right now, there isn't, but there could be a glass of water that a cat is drinking from. You can picture those, right? You can imagine those things. And I've represented them in speaking to you. I've had the thought, and so I've represented it in thought. So we have different ways of representing these facts. We can represent them in thought. We can represent them in language. We can represent them in photographs or images or paintings or things like that. Now, what is a picture? Whether it's a sentence, that's a kind of picture, or a thought is a kind of picture for Wittgenstein, but then there are physical pictures like photographs and paintings, drawings, and so on. What are they like? Well, they're really models of reality. They are an indication of how some part of reality is, if they're true, if they're accurate, or how it could be, but isn't, if they are inaccurate or false. Well, in a picture, objects have the elements of the picture corresponding to them. So, go back to that picture with the cat drinking water from the glass. There are elements of the picture. There's the image of the cat. That corresponds to the actual cat, Zadok. And then there is the glass of water. The picture, the sort of image there of the glass of water corresponds to the actual glass of water. So the idea is that in a picture, the elements of the picture represent the objects. Well, so far you might just say, yeah, boring, right? And there are times when I read the Tractatus and I just think, this is obvious. Okay, there's nothing very exciting going on. But notice what he's saying. This is something he thinks is true, not just of, for example, a photograph or a drawing, but it's something that's true of thought. It's something that's true of language, too. So, a picture, even if it's really a sentence or a thought, is going to have some logico-pictorial form. There must be some form by virtue of which that depicts what it depicts. So, if we think back to that photograph of the cat drinking the water, there is some form by virtue of which it represents a cat drinking water, right? And it's not too surprising. There's something in it that looks like a cat. There's something in it that looks like a glass of water. It gets more complicated if we think about abstract art. If I say, cat drinking water, I'll draw that.
I see it.
I see it.
Yeah, you see a cat drinking water?
Better than my art.
Actually, yeah, that's not bad. That's better than most of my art. I studied drawing and painting for an entire year when I was an undergraduate. And my teachers thought I was good. I thought they were insane. I thought it was terrible. But in any case, if by virtue of what might that represent cat drinking water? I entitle it cat drinking water. And then you can look at it and say, that's its head, yes, and that's the tail. And these must be legs, and here's the bowl of water. In fact, it looks kind of like a fish bowl, doesn't it? You sort of expect a goldfish here. So, anyway, that's something that you could sort of deal with and say, all right, there's something that looks very vaguely like a cat. It gets more complicated if I just give you something, it's like, cat drinking water. It looks like some Chinese character, maybe. Okay, I don't get it. I don't see why that represents anything. And that's because it doesn't have a pictorial form by virtue of which it seems to be able to represent them. So, here's now the stunning move. If we're thinking of pictures in terms of drawings or paintings or photographs, it's easy to see what he has in mind. But then he says a proposition is a picture of reality. So if I simply say the cat drinks water from a glass, that's something that actually also depicts in something like this sense. It also has parts that represent and have a certain form that allows them to represent the cat and the water and the glass. Well, a proposition is true, and here I'm not quoting him. This is just, I think, the general idea. It's true if it maps onto the world. If there's a way of taking certain elements of that picture, of that proposition, of that sentence, of that thought, and saying, that maps onto the cat, that maps onto the water, that maps onto the glass. And those stand in a relationship that corresponds in some way to the relationship they really stand in the world. So here's our basic picture. We can find elements in that proposition. The cat. Oh, look, that corresponds to the cat, Zadok. And then water, that corresponds to what's in the glass. And then the glass, that corresponds to the glass. And then we can say, drinks, A drinks B from C, that's the basic relation. Well, indeed, that relation is holding there. The cat is drinking water from the glass. Okay, so we can actually see how their various parts correspond. Well, the picture theory then is actually a pretty simple way of thinking about this. It's not new to Wittgenstein. It's something that Aquinas, for example, in the Middle Ages held. And so it's not really a new thought at all. In fact, once you identify it this way, it seems almost humdrum. So why do we get anything interesting out of that? Well, first of all, he says a logical picture of facts is a thought. In the case of a photograph, we can say, well, look, I understand what's happening. This part of the image, that stands for the cat, and so on. In a sentence, I don't have too much trouble saying, oh, the words, the cat, represent the cat. But now in a thought, what represents? Well, it's not a physical thing anymore. It's something more abstract. He says there's a logical picture, okay, going on in a thought. And what is a thought? Well, it's a proposition with sentence. A significant proposition, a proposition that has a meaning. So if you want to think of it this way, a thought corresponds to a way the world is or could be. But it's a little more complicated than that. Language, he says, disguises thought. Partly we've got the problem already identified, that it might be that language leaves out certain things that really have to be there in the world, like the blanket being comfortable for me. But there are other ways in which the form of language doesn't really match the form of thought. We use language for all sorts of other purposes. And so think about the ways in which we use language. He talks about this much more in his later work, where it really is designed for other purposes, other than just depicting the way the world is. I've got some examples. Escape from Castle Wittgenstein. That's partly a joke. Senior Center. Don't forget. Remember to turn. Wake up. Lunch only $4. Turn down. Well, notice that's not just depicting the world, right? I mean, don't forget. Remember to turn. Wake up. All of those are commands, right? And one way in which I can be doing something other than depicting the world is commanding. So I can use language for that. There are other things. Actually, I don't know what this is doing. This is a Chinese restaurant in Dalian. And it's entitled Romantic Land and Art Life. So I'm not sure what. I guess it's supposed to be beautiful and romantic, is the idea. But it's somewhat confusing to an English speaker. Here's an old Viking poem, which to love a woman whose ways are false is like sledding over slippery ice with unshod horses out of control, badly trained 2-year-olds, or drifting rudderless on a rough sea, or catching a reindeer with a crippled hand on a thawing hillside. Faith not to do it. So the Vikings had their problems too. Here is someone singing. Someone singing isn't necessarily trying to describe the world. I mean, they might be telling a story or what have you, but they might not be. There aren't that many singing bass players, so when I saw her and there aren't that many female bass players either. So when I saw somebody singing and playing the bass in Copenhagen, who was a woman, I had to get that picture. Oh, here, this actually happened on campus yesterday, although this is a picture of the same thing happening in Denmark. The signs say free hugs. And there were these people just giving free hugs at the bus station. Yesterday it was happening just out in front of the co-op.
Non-free hugs.
Yeah, non-free hugs are very bad. Suppose you go to Starbucks and you say, I'd like a vanilla latte. Well, you're not really, you're not really meaning to describe the world. You're asking for something, right? You might go in, say I worked at Starbucks and I'm sort of an adherent of Wittgenstein. You say, I would like a vanilla latte. I say, yeah, I bet you would. You actually want me to do something, right? You're trying to ask for something. You're not just making an observation about the world. Or here, bring me another beer. Similar type of thing. These are in downtown Austin. I don't know what they mean. Focus, 1 point and breathe. Or let's pretend we're robots. That's not a description of the world. That's an exhortation of some kind. Or here's a quarterback calling an audible. He's not describing things. I mean, he could be. He could be saying, wait a minute, I see the linebacker over there. But no, that's not what he's doing. He's just calling out a play. So it's sort of a command. Or here he's going, hut, hut. That's not a description of the world, right? I mean, Wittgenstein isn't going to say, hut. That's false, I'm sorry. Or here are the cheerleaders shouting Texas fight or what have you. That's an exhortation. That's not really a description of anything. Here are the fans cheering. Again, I don't know what they're saying, but it's not likely to be a description of the world. You can imagine the language this guy was using when his car did that. It probably wasn't a description of the world. So in any case, what about philosophy? Lots of language doesn't really describe the world. It's doing other things. And that means we shouldn't think the form of thought and the form of language are just the same. Nevertheless, he thinks for certain purposes they're analogous enough that we can use language to understand thought. What about philosophy? Well, it aims at the logical clarification of thoughts, he says. It's not a body of doctrine, but an activity. So the philosopher isn't really describing the world. What would a philosopher describe? I mean, scientists describe the world, historians describe the world, but philosophers, what would be our sphere of activity to describe? Well, Sellers says it's a matter of seeing how everything sort of fits together in this big picture. Well, maybe we could do that. But Wittgenstein says, look, really, philosophy is about clarification. It is about logical analysis. It is about, what do you mean? Let's try to get clear on this. What kind of thing is really going on here? But it really has language as its focus and thought as its focus, not the world at all. He says philosophy's job is to set limits to what can be thought. And in doing that, to what can't be thought. It's got to set limits in that way by working outward through what can be thought. It will signify what can't be said by presenting clearly what can be said. So he's giving you a picture here of what you can actually clearly say and clearly think, and then what must lie beyond those bounds of language. Our job is to, you might say, draw the perimeter, draw the fence, and say within this sphere we can actually say meaningful things, like the cat is drinking water from the glass. That's a meaningful description. But most philosophy isn't like that, he thinks. Most philosophy, to the extent that it tries to talk about the world, is engaging in something that has nothing to do with facts. The realist, for example, says, some facts about the world are mind independent. And Wittgenstein will say, that's not a description of the world. I don't understand. The idealist says, no, every fact is mind dependent. Again, Wittgenstein will just say, I don't get it. What are you talking about? You're not talking about the cat drinking water. You're not talking about something in the world. You're making this big global pronouncement about the whole world. He says, I don't get it. So, his claim is everything that can be thought at all can be thought clearly. Everything that can be put into words can be put clearly. And it's philosophy's job to help do that. What is a proposition? Well, he says it's a truth function of elementary propositions. If this were a logic course, I'd now proceed to talk for quite a while about this. Since it isn't, I won't. All I'll say is there are certain basic things that allow us to combine propositions to form other propositions in the Tractatus. Words like and. I can say the cat is on the table and is drinking water from the glass. Or I can say the cat is on the table or asleep on the sofa. Not, I can say the cat is not drinking. I've learned how to get the cat to stop drinking water. Put a lemon or a lime in it. Then the cat doesn't like it. So the cat is not drinking the water because I put a lemon. Or some cat is on the table. All the cats are asleep. So we can construct sentences out of those from these atomic things about objects standing in simple relations and so forth. But that's all. And Wittgenstein then says something dramatic. He says, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Logic pervades the world. The limits of the world are also its limits. So the world has fundamentally a logical structure. Not too much after this, Rudolf Carnap, a member of the Vienna Circle, wrote a book called The Logical Structure of the World. Der logische Aufbau der Welt. Okay, the idea is, indeed, the world has a logical structure fundamentally, and we can determine what that structure is by examining language. This has a number of consequences. One of the interesting ones, the world of the happy man is a different one from that of the unhappy man. Here's the happy man. Here's the unhappy man. Here's Wittgenstein. Now, We could take this in a number of ways. Is he arguing for realism? The limits of the world limits my language? Well, you could take it that way. You might think there are facts, there are states of affairs, they're the objects that make them up, and that's independent of what I think or say about them, but it limits what I can think or say because I've got to restrict myself to saying things about them. You could take all of this in a realist way, or you could take it in an idealist way. Is he saying that the limits of my language determine the limits of my world? Most people have actually thought that's what he means. That does seem to express idealism. What there is depends on my language. And what my language is depends on my thought. And so actually thought is determining the world. And everything ends up being dependent on the mind. Well, officially Wittgenstein's position is these are both meaningless claims. Okay? Neither. They're both nonsense. These are metaphysical positions. And according to the Tractatus itself, all that kind of philosophy is utterly meaningless. There's no fact to which they could correspond. So in a letter to his publisher, he said, what's most important in this book is what I didn't and couldn't say. And indeed, by the end he says, the Tractatus is meaningless. If you've gotten this far in the book, you realize none of the propositions I've written down here, like the world consists of facts, not of things, none of those actually have truth values. None of them are descriptions of facts in the world. So they're actually all meaningless. But he said, nevertheless, they have a use. They're like a ladder that you can use to climb to the point where you see that they're meaningless, and then you can kick them away. So they do something to you, even though they're strictly speaking meaningless. They show you something, even if they can't literally say it. Well, what is left out? A bunch of things get left out. Can't be reconstructed in this way. The whole sense of the world. You say, what's the meaning of it all? Okay? What's the question? He said, there is no question. There is no meaning to it all. If you take the whole world and say, does it all depend on the mind? Or is it all really real independently of us? Or it has this meaning, or it's all good, or it's all bad. He just says that those are not propositions in the world. You can't ask about the totality of the world and formulate any meaningful proposition about it. So any sense, any meaning that the world has to lie in some sense outside of it. In the world, everything is as it is. The cat is on the table. The cat is drinking water from the glass, etc. It happens as it happens. There is no value in the world. Is it good or bad that it happens? That's not something in the world. Okay? And if there were values, they would have no value, he says. So, is the world good? Is the world bad? That's not something that's there in the world itself. So he says there can't be any such things as propositions of ethics. What is just or unjust, right or wrong, good or bad, what you ought to do, ought not to do, all of that is strictly speaking meaningless. It can't be put into words. Other things end up being beyond the bounds. Necessity and possibility, beyond logical ones anyway. Counterfactuals, like if this were the case, then that would be the case. Causation. Actually, I cheated and used the word because a few moments ago, but he can't use the word because. That's not a combination that is truth functional. Attitudes. John thinks this. Hey, Sally knows that. Bob wants that. Freddie is afraid of blah, blah, blah. Those can't really fit in either. They're not truth functions. Yeah.
So is morality fit in all of this?
It doesn't. It's part of what must be passed over in silence. You look at the horror of the First World War, and can you actually say anything about it? No. You can show it. You can show somebody a picture. You can write a poem about it. But can you actually describe it? Can you say, that was horrible? No. You cannot actually articulate. Now, it seems like I just did that, right? I said that was horrible. But he says, that's meaningless. That doesn't describe a fact in the world. So he says, in the end, the riddle of the meaning of life, he says, the riddle doesn't exist. And that itself is the answer. Now, concludes, what we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence.
Yay.
Yeah, and Arthur Pryor at Oxford criticized it this way. What can't be said can't be hinted at either. Which I love. Anyway, so there's silence.